Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of Beards and Cars. For those who are new to the series, this is my podcast style episode based series, sometimes countdowns, sometimes best of or worst of, sometimes discussions about why people do things in the racing world, that kind of thing. And on this occasion, this is another suggested and actually very frequently requested discussion to have in a similar way to when I did ages and ages ago my So You Want to Be a Tuner series. And also much more recently, of course, I did that full comprehensive breakdown of everything you need to know about the livery editor in GT Sport. Those big overarching topics that people would like to know, these smaller tips and tricks about just to get that little bit better. Sometimes if you're an absolute novice, but sometimes if you've even been playing the game the whole time and maybe just didn't realise a particular thing or a small detail. Now, this particular topic is a huge one. Arguably, you could make it just as big as the topic of tuning, because it's such an in-depth discussion. There are so many tips and tricks that you can tell people, and that's why I wanted to take a slightly different approach to this, because this topic is, what advice would I give as somebody who is a quick driver, but not necessarily like a top 10 driver, for instance. As such, being a tuner, a car reviewer, somebody who does a ton of car content, even on YouTube, plenty of racing on multiple games, on multiple platforms for many years, what tips would I give to a pro or to a beginner to become a better driver? And that's why I wanted to take a different approach in this video, because I've got 5 tips. And of course, as always, they are all time-stamped in the description below so that you can see what those are and jump around if you want to, especially for future reference. But the approach that I wanted to take here was to give you some tips that many people don't tell you. Because if you ask the average Joe or even a real pro driver who has a ton of experience what their tips for driving are, they tend to say very similar things. And one of the points on this list is something that you've definitely heard before. However, the approach that I wanted to take wasn't to tell you how to be a faster driver, because that is simply not guaranteed. A different person will have a different skill level and will respond to different tips and tricks differently. What I can tell you is how to be a better driver. And arguably, I would say that that's more important, because being a fast driver doesn't necessarily mean you're a good one. You could be the fastest person in the world around a perfect lap, but then be beaten by plenty of people in an actual race. Being a better driver is about consistency, knowing what you're doing, being comfortable in your car, and being, in effect, a true professional, not just somebody who can set a good lap time. Because, let's face it, there are plenty of fast people who did not end up in the World Finals of the Gran Turismo series, or who have never ended up in, say, the Nissan Academy or anything like that. So being a fast driver is not enough. You have to be a good, consistent driver who knows how to control a car. And that doesn't mean that you'll never make a mistake. I make plenty myself, but these tips can apply to everyone. Now, first of all, the number one tip that I would give is focus on yourself. Now, this is something which sounds like an obvious tip to give someone, and yet it's so obvious that many people would never say it. And what I mean by focus on yourself is kind of twofold. Because when you are on your own, say doing a fast lap or a time trial, it's pretty easy to be a good driver, because there's no one else there to focus on, no one there to give you pressure except yourself. So you can take it at whatever pace you want and improve over time. Where this tip comes in, though, is when you're in an actual race. Because as soon as you see that kind of pressure from people around you, especially as a beginner, but sometimes even as a pro, you can start to focus on what they are doing more so than what you are. You'll start looking behind a lot. You'll start focusing on how they are approaching a corner. How late do they brake? And then you start to, without realizing it, copy them. That's a bad method to use, because it's really good for catching people, but it's not very good once you're in the lead to keep it there, because it basically means that you need someone to set the pace for you. If you focus on yourself, on the other hand, it has a twofold benefit. For one thing, you will be more consistent because you don't need someone else to set the pace for you. And the second important thing is that if somebody else makes a mistake around you, if you are more focused on yourself with, of course, an awareness of what's around you, you will be a driver who has more control, especially if those around you are driving badly or if they lose control in front of you, for instance. As an example, let's say you are on the Nürburgring in a prototype race car. You're coming up behind someone who you are faster than, but you're nervous about beating them because you're fairly close in terms of skill, be it a beginner level if you are a beginner or a pro level if you are such. So you're coming up behind them, you're looking at where they're braking, you're trying to outbrake them, but then suddenly they brake way too late and they go straight off into the sand. Well, if you're focused on copying them and trying to outbrake them, what's going to happen? You're going to go straight on past them, or maybe even smash straight into the back of them. Whereas if you know yourself, and if you're prepped ahead of time, you will know exactly when to brake, you'll know the car, you'll know the situation, the track, and that is far more important than just being able to chase someone, because you don't want to just chase them, you want to beat them. So that's my first major point: focus on yourself. You'll find that you'll become a more consistent driver, and when all the people around you start to make mistakes, you will be able to weave through the pack, even if you're not the fastest of people. If you're more consistent, you will often win. And many of my victories against people who are technically faster than me have happened because of that. They were so concerned about looking behind at me that they end up making a mistake. Whereas I just focus on myself, focus on the consistency, and end up with a win. So that's my first major point. The second one is know your car. This is kind of like Batman, and we're going to come back to this point again for the next point, and that is that there's a common expression around comic books and heroes, and that is that Batman with prep time can beat virtually anyone. But if you drop Batman into a scenario that he's not prepared for, he can be beaten. Likewise with you. Don't worry about how good your opponents are or how good their cars are. Be aware of it and have respect for that skill and for their choice of car and potentially for their tuning, but focus on your driving and your car. Again, it ties into the first point. But if you know your car ahead of time, instead of just jumping into something that you think will win or just copying what the other guys in the lobby, for instance, are using, you will end up being a better driver even if you're in a slower car. Now, again, I'm not telling you how to be the fastest driver on the grid. This is not a guarantee that you will always win, because sometimes people are just better than you, or their car may be tuned better, or the car may just be faster. This, though, gives you the ability, as long as you apply it, to basically improve your skill level across the board. So for instance, most inexperienced drivers will tend to have a favourite car very quickly, and it will tend to be something that's very forgiving, because obviously you're not very skilled, so you want a car that will in effect do some of the work for you. That's why beginners, for instance, tend to love the Nissan GT-R, because it's so fast, but it's also very easy to drive compared to how quick it is. However, you get stuck in that rut, and you see so many players get stuck in that exact rut, just picking whatever car is the easiest to drive or whatever car the majority of the community uses. Sometimes the community will be right, especially if you're talking top 10 or top 20 fastest players, but you will sometimes notice there'll be one or two cars that stand out on those top 10 or top 100 lists, and those are the cars that you should also consider. Don't go for the common consensus. Try other things, learn how to use all of your cars if possible, or at least a wider variety of them, so that it keeps your options open. And just like I said with Batman, if you get some laps in, get some mileage done, try some different tuning, maybe accept help from other people, such as myself, for example, with my tunes here on the channel, give them a try for a particular car if I've done the tune, but also don't be afraid to change things around. Learn what your driving style is, and if you're already a pro or a more experienced driver, just continue to work on the things that you aren't as good at. Maybe, for instance, you get angry when people are too close to you or when they try to brake check you. Anger is not a good thing in racing, and it's easier said than done to remove it, but everyone can work on something, no matter if you're a pro or an absolute beginner. Beginners tend to have more to work on for obvious reasons, but nobody has ever learned anything or everything there is to know about racing. Senna did not know everything there was to know. Schumacher did not know everything. They may know the theoretical, but they could always improve themselves. And part of that is based on the car they're in. And of course, knowing your car, as I said, can make that much of a difference. You will always be more important as the driver, but the car makes a massive difference. So if you want the car to work with you, have the respect to know your car. The third point that I'm going to give you is basically tying directly into that one, and that is prep time. Just like I said again with Batman, that applies to the car, as I just discussed, but also to the circuit. try to get as many mileage, well, not mileage points, but try and get as much mileage and as much time on a wide variety of tracks. Don't stick to the same stuff. Go on city circuits, go on wide open countryside circuits, go on tracks that are very high speed, go on tracks that are really tight and difficult, go on rally tracks even sometimes. Try to broaden your area of expertise, because you might just find that what you end up being really good at is not necessarily what you expected. You might, for instance, love tracks that are very wide open and straight, like the Tokyo Expressway or Le Mans, but you might ultimately find out that you're really good on Laguna Seca, or on Spa, or on a track that maybe you didn't think you would be as good at because they're more technical. That is how you learn, by diversifying your portfolio of racing, not just with cars, but with tracks. Try to get some mileage on each track, try to learn the circuit, because again, you as the driver are very important. The car you're in is very important, but so is the track. And if you know the circuit that little bit better than everyone else on the grid, then that could be the key to a victory sometimes. There are certain tracks where I am not the fastest of drivers. For instance, the Nordschleife. And yet, I have a very good win ratio on that track on every game that I've ever driven on, or every online game in particular that I've ever raced on, because although I'm not the fastest over the course of a lap in terms of, the leaderboards, I'm consistent. I can give a good average lap and a good average speed through all of the corners, and more often than not, that is good enough for a win, because guys who are technically faster than me, again, will be too concerned about what I'm doing, and they'll start making mistakes of their own. Whereas because, again, with point 1 and 2, I'm focusing more on myself, that can result in being more consistent. So try to get as much experience as you can in all of your cars, or at least the main ones, and all of your main tracks, but try to put some mileage on every track in the game if possible, because it's definitely not a bad thing, even the tracks that you don't like. The next point, and this is one which again a lot of people would never even discuss because a lot of people don't think of it, perspective. Perspective changes everything. What do I mean by that? Well, basically, put very, very simply, Gran Turismo does not feel like a fast game. If you play Need for Speed, or if you play Midnight Club, or if you play a wide variety of other slightly more arcade-biased games, or even Forza, if you put it into that very blurry camera mode, they feel every bit as fast as they are. That's very fun, and that's why a lot of people enjoy it. If you then go over to Gran Turismo, it's one of the fewer games with the more sim inclination to it, where the cars don't really feel like they're going as fast as they are. And the reason why is perspective. Because if you drive a car around a particular lap, let's say in chase cam, for instance, but then if you change to bonnet cam, it immediately feels like the car is going quicker. Why is that? Well, it's the perspective. You are closer to the ground. That's why, for instance, if you sit in a double-decker bus on the top floor, it doesn't feel like you're driving that quick. But if you sit in a go-kart going at that same speed, it feels like you're going 3 times as fast because you're so low to the ground. Perspective changes the feeling of speed. And again, this is one of those occasions where I would say, work on your own style. Don't just be the kind of person who uses chase cam. Don't just be the kind of person who uses cockpit cam. Don't just be the kind of person who uses bonnet cam. Try different things and then decide what, it seems, based on your lap times, works best for you. In this video, for instance, you'll notice me use cockpit cam a couple of times and it doesn't go that well. For the reasons that I mentioned, I believe yesterday in a car review, that I just don't like the cockpit cam of prototypes. They're far too pillbox-esque. You can barely see out of the windows compared to a normal road car, and I just can't get the vibe of where the car ends. So often I'll brake too late, I'll turn too late, and it just doesn't work for me. Then, however, if I go into bonnet cam, it completely changes. So perspective changes everything, and in particular with stuff like chase cam, don't be despondent if you look like your car isn't going that quickly. For instance, in this race again, if you look at this car in chase cam, which I'm in most of the time, it doesn't necessarily look like it's going that quick compared to some other racing games. But the reality is, it is going fast, really fast, because if you look at the replay, it looks way quicker. Again, that perspective changes everything. So don't be despondent if you think you look like a slow driver. More often than not, you're faster than you think you are. even if you're a beginner. And again, all of these points tie into each other. And the last point is one which sounds like much more of a cliche, but the reason why I wanted it to cap off my 5 is because it is something that is repeated so often, but it is probably the single most important piece of technical advice that I would give to someone, and that is, you already know it, slow in, fast out. The reason why I wanted to include this is because it's the kind of thing that you say, oh yeah, I've heard that before, I know that. Many people know it, but they still don't do it, because braking early, turning in early, allowing the car to coast just a little bit sometimes through a corner, easing onto the throttle instead of slamming onto it, and exiting the corner correctly, even though it sometimes feels slower, will end up being far faster over the course of a race. And the longer the track and the longer the race, the bigger the difference it makes. In this race, for instance, you'll notice sometimes that I go too fast into a certain corner, and you can see the difference it makes. Whereas sometimes if I brake a little bit earlier, turn in and don't give it as much power, and a front-wheel drive car like this one is a perfect example to show this, I end up having a faster lap because of it. So overall, if you apply these 5 tips, you won't become the fastest driver out there, but you will become better. And you might become a lot better, depending on how good you already are and how well you can apply these tips. So I would say that these points are something which many pros already know to some degree subconsciously, but a refresher is never a bad thing. Professionals train. That's the whole point of those formula test days and practice laps. They're the best drivers in the world, and they still prepare the car. They still train. They still put the time in on the track to learn ahead of time. And one of the biggest ways in which beginners and novices fool themselves is they don't realize how much they don't know. As a general rule in life, the more you know about a topic, the more you realize you still don't know. Whereas people who know very little think that they know a lot. And that is something which is a really beneficial piece of information to remember. For instance, myself, I've always loved cars, and I've always known cars to some degree, but it wasn't until I actually went to college and trained to be a fully qualified mechanic that I realised how little I actually knew beforehand. And there are people who haven't gone who assume that they do know a lot, and again, you don't realise how little you know about something until you look at it intensively. Driving is the same, and I don't claim to know everything there is to know because that would be a ridiculous notion. But if you apply these 5 things, you won't become the fastest out there necessarily, but you will see improvements. And even if you don't see improvements in terms of how many races you win, you'll start to see improvements in terms of consistency, in terms of your lap times, and you will make less mistakes. So overall, I would strongly recommend trying out these 5, and I hope that at least 1 or 2 of them benefit some among you. But overall, that's it for this installment. Of course, stick around next week for another, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.